but I have to face, well, wait a minute, that's going to be, the audio-visual person is going to stand there. So,
I see.
Yeah. There's a method to this, Frank. You know, all right, it's my pleasure to invite introduce our guests, Dale Stanton-Hoyle and Sarah Herndon, today. We've been with this Ministry of Five Talents for well over a decade. The originator of this was our own Everett Post, and Everett is still on their board of directors, and Everett incidentally sends his best to everyone today. Dale has been involved in international development for over 30 years, and he has a background in management and mechanical engineering. I think you've worked in the Congo for years,
yeah,
and comes with a tremendous amount of experience in third world development. And his colleague, Sarah Herndon, she's one of our Virginia University graduates from JMU, and you were in communications, and you handle the development side of, which is the fundraising part of the organization. So in any event, this is one of 5 international ministries that Immanuel on the Hill has been supporting over the years, and they do extraordinary work. And I just want to thank you for your steadfastness in this endeavor and for coming to visit us today, and now tell us all about it. And incidentally, if you have a Q&A, raise your hand and I'll give you the mic so that so everybody can hear. So, with that, Dale, pleasure.
Good morning, everyone. It's such a joy to be here, and our relationship with Immanuel on the Hill goes back deeply, and I continue to work with Everett about every couple weeks. He has bypass surgery, by the way, coming up within the next few weeks, so please keep Everett in your prayers. And let me just start off by showing you a visual from when I was in Congo most recently. This is the crew that I hired back in the 80s, and they're still working there. And part of the reason that I show this slide is because as a mechanical engineer, I headed to Congo right after I graduated, thinking that I was going to be there 1 year as a volunteer. I raised my own funding, and I just loved it so much. I learned so much from the Africans that I had the honor to work with that I ended up staying for almost 5 years. And the other reason that I show this slide is because the people that we hired and trained back in the 80s are still working there today. And that says something about what it's like when you do mission work well. It's not a gift, it's not a handout, it's not doing something for people because they need us. It's a completely cooperative relationship. It's a partnership. And that's what we're going to be talking about a lot more this morning. So how do we get our name? 5 talents. Most of you are familiar with the parable of the talents from Matthew chapter 25. And of course, we tend to think of Jesus most of the time as being a very loving and caring and often even a gentle person. But if you go back and you read what he said in Matthew 25, he was really kind of caustic so much. He was basically saying that poor servant who was scared and only had 1 talent and hid it because he was afraid of his master, Jesus was really hard on him. And I got to ask myself, why? I mean, why would Jesus have been cruel or mean or critical of someone who was scared? I think it's because Jesus understood how important it really is for every person to live their life fully, and that God gives every person talents equal to the talents that we have. And so the key to the name of our organization is that we are in ministry with these people who have all of these gifts that God has given them. And because we are in this partnership, people in the United States, people in Europe, people who have material access to wealth and money, we're able to help them release the gifts that God has already given them. I mean, look at these faces. These are not people that deserve our pity. These are not people who are experiencing shame. These are people who are experiencing the joy of life, and they have lives in Africa just like we have lives here. You can see we work in 9 countries around the world, in Bolivia, in Latin America, in Myanmar, and then in 7 countries in East Africa, most recent of which is a program that we started about a year ago in Rwanda. To give you an idea of quickly how we work, please listen to this story about Rachel, which is narrated, by the way, by an Englishman who is a Shakespearean actor.
Sarah lived in South Sudan with her husband and 4 small children. They were happy. Then in 2015 the war came, civil war, 500,000 dead, including her husband. So she left everything, like a million others. A widowed mum and 4 young kids, walking, 100 miles to a refugee camp. Just another face in another place, in another tent. Hopeless. Or not, because Sarah was strong, incredibly strong. All she needed was a helping hand, and she got it. Imagine a group, 20 women, not giving up, but meeting together, twice a month, sharing pain and sharing dreams, learning how to read and write and count and save. Not getting handouts, but learning to save. 20 women, tiny amounts every week. After 6 months, there was enough to lend, and Sarah borrowed from her own group, enough to buy coffee, lentils, beans, and sell them on a stall, and make a profit. And the profit made the difference, and the difference was huge. They could all eat. She could pay for her kids to go to school. Her eldest son is going to university. As Sarah says, alone I could not manage, but with my group I can do anything. She's paid back her loan, but she still has dreams. She lives in a tent, but dreams of a house. She has a stall, but dreams of a shop. Sarah doesn't need your help, but a million others desperately do. For if Corona's hit us hard, it's hit the poorest even harder. 5 Talents is a charity that helps set up and run savings groups for the poorest of the poor, all over Africa. They are, if you like, a helping hand for the helping hands.
So Sarah was hopeless, or not. And like so many of the others that we have the privilege to work with, the generosity of this community has helped to make it possible for literally millions of people, hundreds of thousands of participants and their family members, and the people that they employ to grow businesses and enrich their lives in ways that you just saw. We go through a 7-step process where the first thing we do is, unlike most organizations, we don't move into an area and say, hey, we're here to help you. We always get invited in by a bishop or an archbishop of the Anglican Church. And the first thing they do is they put together a group of leaders in the villages and the communities outside of cities, and they say, you figure out what is most needed in this area. And then when they tell us whether or not the programs, the micro-enterprise programs, the business development training, the literacy training, if they tell us that those are the things that actually will meet the needs of their people, then if we can get the money, we start a program in their area. So we usually start with literacy training because unlike most groups that are involved in all kinds of business training, 5 Talents is working in places where no one else works. We go to places in South Sudan where the United Nations won't even let people into the relocation camps. But they let us in because we are not strictly involved in evangelism or proselytization, despite the fact that we are a Christian organization. We go to places where one of our board members took a 4-wheel drive vehicle in Burundi to the end of the road, and then they kept going. And when the dirt road ran out, they started bumping their way through the grass until they finally got to a village where everyone came out laughing and clapping and smiling and singing and invited them there because they were so thrilled to see the group that had made it possible for them to form local savings groups to start new businesses. In step 3, after they save their own money, Not money from gifts from donors, but their own money. And because they trust one another, then they can apply for a loan. And I'm sure you've seen the television show Shark Tank, and you've seen all the pitches that they make. Well, in order to be able to get a loan from any of our groups, they have to pitch a business plan that actually makes sense, and usually one that will pay back in about 6 months or less. So unlike the money lenders who sometimes charge thousands of % in interest, and unlike others who string the poor out on long loans, these groups are structured in ways that help them to be able to succeed in any new business they would start. Those groups make loans to part of the members based on interest rates that they decide themselves. They elect a president and a secretary and a treasurer, and we don't have anything to do with it by that point, because our money has paid for the training of trainers, and then those trainers have trained people that fan out to rural areas and sometimes urban areas all over the country. And they create their own constitution, and they decide if they're going to charge an interest rate that is usually commensurate with the inflation rate of their country. So a low rate of something like 1.5% per month. So 18% per year may sound high compared to the United States, and it is, but if someone else is charging hundreds of % interest, kind of like a money lender, then these people charging each other only 18% per year in an environment where inflation is usually very high is actually a very low interest rate. So then after members get their loans, they start their businesses, they buy their beans, they sell them, they buy a goat, they sell the milk, and then they quickly pay back the group. And all the other members of the group who are not investing in new businesses, they get that 18% interest just for being willing to save their money. And it's sometimes incredibly small, as little as 50 cents a week. And you would think, how could that possibly transform a life? But it's amazing that it often can. The interest is then kept by the group, and at the end of each year, they give it out as dividends, and if people want, then they can reinvest it at the beginning of the next year. And then the most important thing, at the end of about 2.5 to 3 years, almost all the groups that we help to start, they graduate. And that is the most radical concept of all, because very few international development organizations can say every single day, we are working ourselves out of a job. And so by the end of 2.5 to 3 years, these groups go into a post-funding status. What happens after that? Well, to be perfectly honest, no one really knows until today. And I'm about to share some news with you that very few people in the world have ever seen, and you got to promise not to put it on Facebook or any other social media today, because on the 12th of this month, it's going to be released on the floor of Parliament in London. It's going to be, we hope, picked up by the New York Times. This is a preview of what is very exciting that we have just learned. Over the last 22 years, 144,000 people in the tiny country of Burundi, the smallest country that we work in, with only about 11 to 12 million people, have already had 144,000 people who have learned how to read and write. Almost 3% of the entire literate adult population of the country has graduated from 5 Talents programs. 2,900 groups have been formed through the funding that we provided, but this is the most amazing statistic. So amazing that the person who was hired as a consultant who works full-time for the European Union and for USAID and for other international organizations said she couldn't believe the numbers, and she went back and re-administered the survey to find out whether or not there was a mistake. Out of 2,900 groups that we paid for, they found 6,200 groups in operation. So not only were the groups persisting year after we stopped providing any funding, but they were self-replicating. Because in the rural areas around some of the cities and in the villages out in the countryside, the other bishops were seeing what was going on next door, and they said, this is so powerful, this is so important to the transformation of these communities that we are going to start more groups ourselves without even receiving any funding from 5 Talents. And that is the best news I have heard in the last 6 years that I've been associated with 5 Talents. No other group that I am familiar with has ever published any information like that. You can see it was quite an extensive survey. The entire process went on for more than a year. There were about 500 respondents, and so it was quite comprehensive and therefore reliable. Again, because the survey period covered 22 years, the first 10 years of which Mothers Union Burundi was doing their own literacy program, and then for the last 12 years, Five Talents got involved and added on all the business training and savings group formation. So over that 22 years, what you see is that in the results to the survey, the vast majority had actually been involved for 13 to 22 years. I mean, just imagine the impact that that has on a tiny country like that. The savings activities have had a great impact on the women who used to wait for their husbands to provide. They've started saving and can contribute to household provisions. They are now valued and they have self-esteem. They are more confident. So our previous board chair used to say, we never intended to create a program for women's empowerment. We basically wanted to provide people with what an African bishop came back 25 years ago and said was needed, which is microfinance opportunities. But when we started providing these opportunities to everyone, who responded? 80% of the participants were women because the men had other opportunities. And also because the women were taking care of the children, collecting firewood, collecting water, doing the daily meal preparation. And so while the men could go off and do something like push a bicycle for 100 kilometers in order to be paid to transport goods, the women who stayed home in the villages, they were desperately trying to figure out a way to help their children have a better life than they did. And they are the ones who benefited most from this program. The leadership roles really surprised me. More than 50% of the women said that they had now become church leaders, that they had become a community leader, and to my great surprise, even had stood for an election. So it's not surprising that most of the women were able to do things like get goats and pigs. I was a little bit surprised that some of them were able to afford cell phones, but we're not talking about $800 smartphones. We're talking about like $10 little flip phones, which they can often use for mobile banking in these countries, because in those countries where people don't have landlines and they don't have ATMs, mobile banking is much more prevalent than in the United States. I absolutely never would have believed that 50% of the program participants actually were able to buy land. I mean, this is just unheard of. I think the number before they participated in the program was probably less than 5%. And then some of them bought a cow. Okay, so why is that such a big deal? Well, when my wife Lynn and I were traveling in Burundi, and again, we got out of a four-wheel drive Land Cruiser after we had bumped our way down the dirt road, then we started walking down the path through some fields of produce that were being grown until we got to this woman's house, and she showed us her chickens. And when I say her house, of course, I mean, you know, a thatched roof, mud walls. And she showed us her chickens, and then she showed us another little thatched area that had a little door on it made of bamboo or something, and inside were her goats. And then she walked over to this mud-walled structure with a thatched roof, and she said, "This is my cow." And we said, "Okay." She said, no, you don't understand. This is my cow. And we said, okay. And then the translator said, you obviously don't understand. Women in Burundi don't own cows. This was just extraordinary, that she had started off years earlier with a loan with chickens and eventually been able to buy goats, and then eventually had her own cow. So we think about the fact that most of these women have 4 to 6 children, and that's why we say that if there have been about 300,000 program participants, that there's actually been almost 2 million people who've been affected by the program. Because if you say, okay, an average of 4.5, 5 kids per family, you know, for every program participant, et cetera, et cetera. What we didn't realize until we got back this data a couple weeks ago is that even the female participants were employing, 60% of them were employing 1 to 2 employees. Now, I had been picturing, someone making porridge in the marketplace and no employees and just a tiny, tiny business. But this actually shows that over the years, this had grown enough that they had actually employed 1 to 2 employees each. And you can see there's about 40% that have more than 2 employees. So it's no wonder that Melinda Gates says that when you transform a woman's life, you transform the life of her community. You can literally transform the impact on an entire country. One female participant said, "My parents never sent me to school. It was believed that education was only for the boys. And for the girls, their role was to do household chores, and after becoming literate, I decided to send my 10-year-old daughter to school so that she could escape the ignorance that I used to live with. I was able to support her in school through the savings group. I was also able to send her younger brothers to school. Now I'm very happy." And a pastor in Matana, an area where we were traveling in Burundi, about an hour's drive outside of Bujumbura, the capital, said women and men who were illiterate can now stand in front of us and preach. They can read the Bible. They contribute to the church as lay leaders. The woman leader in Ngozi was part of this program. And when you see her now, you cannot tell that she used to be illiterate, that she used to be part of a literacy circle. And so this is probably the most common thing that we hear when people get their diplomas at the end of their 6 months of literacy training. I can read my Bible now. But what we didn't realize until we started gathering this data was that they weren't just reading it in their own homes, they're actually becoming church leaders in ways that we only could have dreamed of. So, what's next for 5 Talents? We have so much more to do. We've just started new programs in Mombasa, Kenya, where some of us were 3 weeks ago. We are expanding into new villages literally every year in Burundi. The new program that I mentioned to you in Rwanda is going extremely well, and the same thing is true in Tanzania, where we quadrupled the size of the program overnight because another organization decided that it was time for them to pack up and leave, and we were able to move in and take advantage of the local Anglican church's relationship with Mothers Union and immediately ramp up the program there. And we hope during the next 4.5 years to go to 3 new countries. The most likely candidates right now are Zambia, Malawi, and Honduras. So, one of the reasons why we hope to be able to go to Honduras is because we know that it's a whole lot easier for you all to travel 5 hours than it is to travel 30 hours to get to East Africa. And it's really not safe right now to go to places like DR Congo or South Sudan. So, many things that we are hoping as we hope to double the size of our organization over the next 5 years. How can you all help? This is the second time that I've been here for this adult hour, but we also have a series of virtual tours that Sarah has helped us put on, and they are really quite good. Part of the reason is that during the pandemic, nobody got on airplanes, including us. And by the way, how did our partners do during that time that we could no longer visit them? They did just great. And we didn't realize that that would be the case, but it was really both humbling and exciting to see that the model of the program worked beautifully. They really didn't need us to be there. But during that time, we hired a local Kenyan company that does video production. They sent in the crews, they set up the mics, they even hired a pilot to manage the drone, because legally there, in order to be a drone operator, you have to have a pilot's license. And so there's all kinds of wonderful aerial photography that became part of this virtual visit to Kenya. And any of you who can't get on an airplane sometime in the next 6 to 9 months, please let the folks like Sarah at 5 Talents know that you might be interested in having a virtual trip to Kenya. Takes about an hour to 2 hours, depending on how many things you want to include in it, Just the video material and the Q&A is about an hour, and if you want to actually participate in a mock savings group meeting and things like that, then sometimes we've done it as much as a 3-hour session. People come in and eat Kenyan food and celebrate and have a good time on a Saturday afternoon. Congregational visits like this one, I hope that you'll invite us back next year. Partnerships with the programs. So Americans often want to get their fingers into the work. They want to be corresponding, they want to be helping, they want to be communicating with our partners. Well, it's difficult when most of them don't speak English, but it is possible. And so we have a church in Texas, for example, an Episcopal church in Dallas, that has developed about a 9-year relationship with programs in Kenya, where fortunately they do speak English. And so they've already visited in the northwestern part of the country with about half a dozen of their congregational members, and this October they'll be going back to the new program in Mombasa. And they, of course, are helping to provide significant funding, so they kind of think of it as their program. We probably would not have started that program if they had not made the 7-year commitment that they did. So please set your sights high. It really is possible to make it a reality for us to start whole new programs if a congregation like this wants to be significantly involved. We need your prayers, and I would appreciate that. And finally, of course, you all have been fantastic financial supporters. Every year, I would say, we keep track of how the pumpkins are selling because we know it's eventually going to lead to how much you all can potentially give. But even if the pumpkins are not selling well, I think that the congregation has other assets, and I would ask you to please share those assets. My wife and I share our own financial assets with 5 Talents because we just think it's the best thing around. We used to support a lot of other organizations, and obviously we support our local church, and you all need to continue to support a whole variety of things, including this church. But there is absolutely, I mean, part of what convicted Lynn and me is that there is just no other organization that can take $1 and make it go as far as 5 Talents does. We have over 1,000 volunteers worldwide. So every dollar that we send over worldwide gets multiplied by those volunteers, and then it gets multiplied again by the people who are saving their own money and lending it to the people that they are participating with in their savings groups of about 20 people. So thank you. Thank you for the years and years of support that you all have provided and for making it possible to get together and talk today. I'll stop now and take your questions. And I think Jim's got the microphone for you.
Thank you for that inspiring talk. It's really good to see some wonderful work that you've been doing for so many decades. I had a specific question. You didn't talk too much about Sudan, and in particular South Sudan. There's a very volatile situation over there. Are your volunteers safe? Is your program safe? How are things in the Sudan?
Great. So first of all, there's economic intercourse between South Sudan, where we are operating, and the country of Sudan, which of course has these 2 men that have been fighting with each other and putting Khartoum and the whole country into conflict. It's actually a little bit amazing that in the area of Rank, which if you look on a map looks like a stovepipe kind of in the northeastern corner sticking up into the country of Sudan. It's an area that's had more than its own fair share of difficulties because of flooding from the White Nile there. And ironically, they used to be able to bring in most of their commerce because it's very inaccessible from the rest of South Sudan. So the biggest impact on our partners has been that it's hard for them to get food now across the border from Sudan. But because there's so many refugees now that are fleeing from the violence and the war, they're actually coming over the border and they are staying in the churches of our members in Rank. So that's kind of the impact that it's having. I don't think any of our folks have been in danger yet, but it's certainly been an economic hardship. Well, there are religious differences. Yeah, so for those of you who don't know, all of what used to be Sudan and now is the two countries of Sudan and South Sudan. And by the way, South Sudan is both the youngest and perhaps the most fragile country in the whole world. There is a large Christian population in South Sudan. In Sudan, it's almost all Muslim. But there's also a lot of Muslim population in South Sudan. And then to make things even much more complicated, there's the two largest ethnic groups are the Nuer and the Dinka within South Sudan, but there's really at least 20 or 30 different ethnic groups. And there is quite a bit of tension and sometimes killing that goes on between those groups. There's a gentleman who works at Notre Dame who's a specialist in trauma healing, absolutely marvelous professor and consultant. And I was at a meeting of South Sudanese diaspora about 4 years ago where he spoke. He said he did not think that there was a single person left in South Sudan who had not been traumatized in some way. So when I was traveling there with our program manager, our senior program manager, Maria Owen, we met with the Peace and Justice Reconciliation Commission, who had developed a curriculum partly based on curriculum from the American Bible Society, but had been added to for local context there. And we now use that curriculum to teach workshops in trauma healing. Why do we do that? We do it because we were specifically asked to by the local leaders. Just like everything else we do, it's only if we are asked that we begin to make an offering like that. There was a woman who was walking through the center of a village area, kind of an open area in between various huts. And all of a sudden she fell to her knees and started crying uncontrollably when she was walking alongside one of our trainers. And the trainer tried to console her, tried to calm her, tried to find out what on earth she was wailing about. And finally she controlled herself just enough to point across the intersection and say, "That man, he killed my brother and my father." So over the ensuing weeks, they found themselves in the same trauma healing workshop. Within about 6 weeks, this woman stood up before her peers and she said, this man who killed my father and my brother, I have learned to forgive him. So this is not therapy, but this is something extraordinarily powerful going on there, something we can truly be grateful for.
Other questions? Whoop, whoop.
Thanks. I guess I have a two-part question. So the first part is I wasn't quite clear how the women get the money in the beginning. Is that before they're in the training group? And the second question is, do you see a reduction in the number of children that the women have when they're in these groups?
A number of children, what?
That the women have when they're in these groups?
Right, yeah, great question. So the two-part question, how do the women get the money to start off with to be able to lend to one another, to be able to save? And do we see a reduction in childbirth? So the answer to the first question is, most people that we have worked with have some money from a whole variety of sources. From family, from their husbands, from, if it's a man, because 20% of the program participants are men, you know, they get it from their employment. So they're, you know, we're not talking about hundreds of dollars, but for them to be able to get 50 cents to $1 a week, they generally have access to some money. They may even, for example, already be doing subsistence farming to help feed their family, and they may be selling 10% of what they grow. So they may be making just enough money to kind of get started, but they don't have really enough money to create a business, nor do they even necessarily understand the basic business skills and how to calculate a profit and how to count your own time toward the business and those sorts of things. We know from Melinda Gates' book, The Power of Lift, that and also from Han Rosling's book, Factfulness, that it is completely predictable that as people move upward out of the greatest depths of poverty, that their birth rates will go down. We have not gathered that data for our participants, so we really can't say, like I showed you some of the statistics earlier, whether or not that's true with our participants, but we can surmise that it probably is true. One of the things that Hans Rosling says that is so insightful is that if you're standing on top of a 60-story building and you're looking down, all the 2-story buildings and 6-story buildings pretty much look the same. But when you're down on the ground, the difference between a 2-story building and a 6-story building looks huge. Well, when you're living in the United States in great wealth as people of privilege, all people living in poverty kind of look like they're living in similar conditions. But the difference between whether or not you're cleaning your teeth with a stick versus whether or not there's one toothbrush that's shared by the family versus whether or not there's one toothbrush per person is a huge difference within those different levels of poverty that we often know nothing about. And so when people are in the level 1 out of 4, when they're living in the greatest, most extreme poverty, which is most of the people that Five Talents are working with, for them to even be able to go from level 1 to level 2 makes a huge difference, first of all, in whether or not you can pay for school uniforms, whether or not you can pay for school fees for the girl children, and then eventually that does mean that the birth rate goes down considerably. Because like when I lived in Congo, the main thing that we heard was, oh, we got to have more children, because otherwise when I get old, who's going to take care of me? There is no social security system. So you're exactly right.
It's inspiring to hear again, and it seems like it's a case of you can see the potential power of capitalism at work.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering if you've been subject to a liberal critique of capitalism, which seems very fashionable now in certain circles. I'm not saying I feel that way.
Well, I mean, the short answer is no. I have not heard any liberal critiques of the capitalism involved in this. And I mean, to be perfectly honest, a lot of our donors are pretty conservative, but we also have lots of Presbyterians, United Methodists, and Episcopalians who are quite liberal. And I think that people just sort of recognize that, number one, it's kind of biblically based in Jesus is saying, my gosh, what is wrong with you, you crazy, servant who was scared? Why didn't you at least invest this and make interest off of it? So, for example, in Bolivia, where the church is tied tightly to the Pentecostal church there, it's kind of ecumenical with a lot of different churches participating. It's much more conservative. It's a mission church. A lot of them just don't even believe in earning interest. And so there have been some problems with our program kind of catching hold there because they were concerned about the concept of interest. But we pointed out to them that Jesus was saying, hey, come on, why didn't you earn interest on the money? And so I think people just feel like it's genuine enough that it rings true. I mean, there may be plenty of good things and bad things about capitalism, but I think this is one of the good things, that people recognize that folks experience an important aspect of their self-worth when they are able to get a job. And everyone that we have worked with internationally, they want to work. These are some of the smartest, most creative people I've ever had the privilege to work with. They are not lazy, they are not stupid, they just need an opportunity for a job.
It's getting a little late, but I guess we may have time for one more question. Anybody? Rick?
You got one up in the front too.
In the U.S., a large proportion of new businesses fail. So it must happen in your program also that because of illness or bad weather or lack of market. So what happens if someone isn't able to repay the loan?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the loan repayment rates are about 90%. Back when, again, one of our board members said, the way we got to learn how to do things really, really well was by doing it wrong for about 10 years. And we had what were called credit-led programs, where people in the United States were putting money into capital, and then people living in poverty were borrowing that capital to start new businesses. Problem with that is that if you have any kind of an emergency, if you have a flood or a drought or a child who's terribly ill and you need money for hospital bills, how are you gonna make a choice between taking care of your own child versus paying someone back on time 6,000 miles away that you've never met? Obviously, you're gonna take care of your child. Well, by contrast, in these small savings groups of about 20 people, they have a lot of social capital. They don't have any collateral that they can take to a bank. They don't have a W-2, they don't have a home mortgage or a home deed that they can take to the bank and say, please give me a loan because I've got this to prove that I have collateral. They have collateral within the community. People know who is going to be responsible. And when they pitch their business plan, the members of the group, a little tiny group of only 20 people, they pretty well know whether or not this person is going to be able to repay their loan within 6 months or not. And so that's what I think contributes to a very high success rate. The other thing is that even though there are unforeseen circumstances, like there was a locust, huge infestation about a year ago in Kenya that affected folks. There's also been a lot of drought in areas. There's been flooding in other areas. There's been lack of irrigation water that's related in some areas to climate change. There's just been so many impacts. But if you're walking through the village on a Saturday morning and there are 8 women selling beans and one of them is one of the members of your savings group, you're probably pretty likely to buy your beans from that woman, which is going to help her to repay her loan, which is going to help you to make your interest. So whether or not that's good or bad, I think that's just human nature. People they tend to support each other in many ways. And it was just extraordinary. When we were in Mombasa 3 weeks ago, we met with a group of 20 who were all women. They were all widows. And the way that they supported each other was just phenomenal. I mean, when they needed something, they were there for each other. And they were there for the church. They said once a month, their job is to prepare everything for the church and clean the church and get everything ready for that week's service. And they felt empowered as a group, both to support one another. When anyone was sick, they're taking them food and visiting them in the hospital. And then once a month preparing for worship gave them an opportunity to feel like they were giving back to the congregation. So I think part of the reason why the loan repayment rate is very, very high is for those reasons.
Was Myanmar, was that one of the countries listed?
Yes.
I was surprised. That's kind of like South Sudan. There's a lot of danger there, is my understanding.
Yeah, so much danger, in fact, in Myanmar that the savings groups of roughly 18 to 25 people were no longer able to meet as a full group because the military were afraid to see that many people meeting in any one place. So they got creative. They split up into subgroups, and they would meet in groups of about 8 to 10 in people's homes, and apparently the military left them alone. I mean, it was terrible. The provincial head of Mothers Union there in Yangon, whom I've had a chance to meet with 3 or 4 times now, she could hear gunshots near her house when the coup occurred about 2 years ago. And the banking system there broke down so badly that they loved getting our hard currency. They just wouldn't let our program partners withdraw it. So we actually ended up having to work through a bank in Thailand to be physically carrying in money to continue to pay for our program. Now we get receipts. We have transparency in all of our banking. We're not involved in anything that's illegal or shady, and all of our books are audited. But it just shows how difficult it can be. I mean, I've been part of a whole variety of congregations that said, gosh, we can communicate with people by email now, we can send funds, but they can't work out some of these difficult things that we spend a lot of time getting just right. And our program team is just incredible. So the program continues, the seminary continues to teach. We have a new businesses mission curriculum that's now being taught to pastors there in the capital in Yangon. And so even new savings groups are forming as we speak. It's amazing.
Well, why don't we call it a morning, an
Thank you all.
afternoon almost. Dale and Sarah, thank you for coming. You guys are doing wonderful work, and we're delighted to continue our support.